Bonjour, mon ami, and welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker, and this week I'm going to be leading you through the streets of Paris. We're going to be looking at a rainy day in Paris and developing a tonal study. We are going to be building on last week's exercise of edges, where we painted a pedestrian and an umbrella and their pet dog walking through the rain. We used a variety of edges. This week we're going to bring those edges to our tonal study and develop a painting of the streets of Paris. Have a look below where you can find a link in the description that leads to a free PDF file providing more information on this subject. It's really going to start to move around a little bit. As they recede. Back at the table, I'm getting ready to do our drill for today. The drill is focused or centered around creating different types of edges in watercolor. And I'm taping down a piece of scrap paper. Any sort of painting, that didn't work out, I turn it over. The backside is perfectly usable, and especially for doing a drill or some sort of exercise, works well. I'm going to divide this in half vertically. I want to do two little paintings here, two little studies. And in this exercise, as I said, we're kind of focused on how we create different edges in watercolor. And edges communicate a lot. They communicate the type of light that we're seeing. They communicate the type of atmosphere or the quality of the air. Is it damp? Is it dry? We use edges to kind of communicate this. So we're going to take from our subject today, which is some figures in the rain, and we're going to use different edges to express it. So let's just use the pencil to draw a few shapes here. Shape of a figure, maybe some distant figures, a group, maybe, a little. Let's put this guy a little higher up. I'm going to restate him, make them reach about here. And we'll create an umbrella. Distant figures means about the same shape, smaller than this one, but sort of lining up. The heads are lining up. We'll put them on level ground. Umbrella. Maybe an umbrella here as well. Okay, that's plenty of drawing. As I said, it's just kind of an exercise. And I'm using a couple brushes here. For the first exercise, I'm just using the sablette that I have. A large one and a medium-sized one. That's all we need. And we start by putting out a little fresh color. Colors that I'm using are the ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, brown and blue. Can be any two colors really. We're painting figures in the rain today. And so the colors themselves when it's raining can be rather dull or gray. And I find that these two colors of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, when they combine, they make a nice gray. And it's very easy to vary the gray. So I can easily make it a cool gray or a warm gray. All right, so we'll pull some burnt sienna over here. Mix it up. When you're using fresh color, you have to perhaps take a little more time to blend it on the palette or dilute it. But the color moves and adjusts so much easier when it's fresh, and you don't have to spend too much time mixing, which I find is important when we do some of the other techniques of wet into wet or lost and found edges. Soft edges or hard edges. Soft edges or lost and found edges, I'm sorry. So I've got the two colors here. And we'll mix them together. And we'll make a first figure, right? And we start, right, with our familiar blobs. Just a couple blobs. A little larger blob. And this represents the torso. Off of that torso, let's put a leg coming down. Perhaps an arm. Another arm. Just to get a sense of the figure. I always find when I'm beginning that my first figures often look a little stiff. It's not until I start to do a few of them that I get more of a natural feeling. Okay, twins there. Any case, they read as figures pretty quickly. Figures kind of walking towards us. Let's put an umbrella. Well, let's finish these first. I'm putting the head a little to the left on this figure and a little bit to the right on this figure so they look like they're maybe having a conversation or something. And an umbrella. And we're working on dry paper here with a fairly wet brush. I haven't even had to refill my brush yet. That's the strength of a good watercolor brush, is really carries a lot of paint, and you can add paint, of course, but you can also go for a long time without adding paint. And this figure we'll just put coming straight towards us. So a little head there. We'll vary the gray a little bit with a little more burnt sienna and create an umbrella for this figure. A little bigger. Just the classic umbrella shape is all we need, you know. And we don't need much more than that. Figures in the rain. And of course, when you're out in the rain, you still need to walk your dog. So let's start with the blob. Sort of I'll do a classic, almost like an oval is all you really need to get started. And off of that, I usually bring one leg forward and one leg back. So actually 2 legs forward, one a little lower than the other. So it looks like we're looking down on this dog just a little bit. And I don't know, just a couple points for the ears. What are we doing? We're basically painting a silhouette. Tail. This is really all we need for a dog. We can, after it dries, we could add some features. Oops. See, now my head is getting a little big. Classic dog. Figures, walking, dog. And of course we can add to that, but for this exercise, that's perfectly simple. All right, so the main edge that we're utilizing here is hard edges. Look at the edges on all these shapes. Pretty uniform, hard edges, and that's created by using a wet brush on dry paper. Dry paper is not going to manipulate the edge at all. And this is the way that most of us learn watercolor. We start by learning this technique. Let's call it wet on dry. Wet on dry. Why do we start this way? It's just easier. Our marks stay put. They don't move. We can adjust them, of course, if we want. It's a sort of stable way to paint because the paint stays where you put it. Even on this angled surface, the marks stay where I put them. And we'll put some reflections coming straight down. Let's mix up some more paint. Reflections just tend to be a little bit lighter. In this case, you make a big blob. So we elongate the figure when we're doing reflections. And we line it up vertically. Reflections always come to us. So to us means the viewer. And so we always bring them straight down. In this case, we're kind of facing the painting, so the reflection is going to come straight down. And it doesn't have to be a mirror image. It just has to be close to convince the audience. Also, we're doing these on dry paper. These can be, joined just like the figures. And a little hint of the umbrella is good. Not picture perfect, just a little shape on top of the figures like that gives the impression that there's an umbrella there. Well, this is the first type of edge I wanted to show you, which is hard edges. All my edges are pretty uniform and pretty hard. And it's an easy way to work. It's a way that we're comfortable. We can place marks on top of our drawing and really control the painting. And what we need to do this is, a good sized brush that's fully loaded. We don't take out any of the paint really when we're making these marks. And we put it onto dry paper. So those two things combine of a wet brush and dry paper to help us make these marks. We're going to do the same image basically in the second panel. Now I want to vary the technique. I want to vary the edge to show you another way. Another way to create edges. I'm sorry, the technique to create different edges. That's a better way to put it. And an umbrella over here. In this technique, we're going to use a wet surface. So we're going to wet the paper. And while the paper is wet, we're going to make our same image. So what do we call this? Wet into wet. or sometimes it's called dry into wet, depending on how much paint or the quality of the paint that's in the brush. So what does that look like? Let's get started. So I've made the marks on the paper, and I'm going to start by using a wide brush, a brush that holds a lot of water, and just wet the paper. Top to bottom. This is just clean water, and you can see by the shine that it's very wet, not leaving any spaces, covering everything. This way is more complicated, and it's, I would say if you're thinking advanced technique, this is one of the more advanced techniques, working wet into wet, because a lot is related to timing, and a lot is related to controlling the consistency of the paint on your paper. So I've carried quite a bit of water to my page, really soaked it. And while it's in that state, I'm just going to drop in. I'm diluting my gray here, very light gray. Just using the leftovers of my previous washes. And I'm just going to just put a few little marks there. Not really painting anything particular, just putting some color on the surface because I want you to see how working, this is very wet into wet. So the marks really dissolve almost instantly. Let's put a little sharper mark through that. There, that's plenty. And it's a fun way to paint because watercolor does its own thing. And I don't know, I feel that this technique is really at the heart of what we do in watercolor. We're taking advantage of the wet paper and the nature of water, letting them mix, letting them drift. So you kind of have to give leeway to the media itself. All right, so now I mentioned timing, so I have to get busy here. Now I've switched to my smaller brush, mixing up a color, same two colors, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and timing. The clock is running now. So this is one technique where we have to go faster than we're comfortable with. Ideally, I should have these colors mixed up beforehand. Let's put one touch and see what happens. Just here. And look at that, the mark is staying put. Why is that? It's because I've switched to a smaller brush, take out a little bit of that moisture or paint with a paper towel, place the mark into that very wet area, same thing, 2 blobs, add a couple legs. This is more what we would call dry into wet. So the brush itself has thick paint on it. It's a small brush, so it's not carrying too much liquid. We take a little bit of that out. Let's put the umbrella on this side this time. And our marks dissolve. Look at the edges of those marks, very soft. They're dissolving, but they're not drifting away like the previous marks. The previous marks have become an atmosphere now, or they become sort of just a loose color that's in the painting. The marks that I'm placing now are very soft, and they still describe the figures, but the figures now feel like they're in a very heavy atmosphere, and that's because of the soft edges, and we're trying to take advantage of that. So if I notice it's getting a little dry up here, I just try to, from a distance, spray that. Don't spray too close in this case. Keep it at a distance. Let's mix up our main figure. Now we're starting to feel a little more comfortable with these figures that we're painting. And we'll paint this with a little stronger paint. This is where I think using paint, fresh paint, has a benefit because you don't have to really work too hard to get the consistency that you want. You just take from the fresh paint and look at how thick it is on the surface. It's not moving too much. Let's paint in some legs, arm, and the umbrella. Well, let's put the head maybe looking off the shoulder, and the umbrella coming right over that. We do sacrifice control with this technique. In other words, there'll be a little drifting here. My figure might get a little large. It's okay. I've made this one a little darker. That means a little thicker paint. And our dog will make darker still, thicker paint. Let's take that paint out of the brush a little bit and make a mark, just the same sort of oval. So you'll find that in practicing this technique, you know what's going to happen. You can start to anticipate what is going to happen. Is it going to be too wet? Is it going to drift away? Is it going to stay pretty much in place? And let's carry this down into the shadow or the reflections. The bottom of our painting is very wet, so we don't need to add any moisture here. It's very wet because all of the paint is drifting down. And we'll make these, let's try to make these a little paler. So I've added some water here. Now the paint is much looser, much more fluid. And you'll notice an immediate difference when you make the mark to the page. I'm going to blot some of this. So it's really going to start to move around a little bit. Again, reflections coming straight towards us. But I want you to appreciate the quality of now we start to feel an atmosphere. Here it feels either it's a very bright day or there's no real quality to the air. Everything kind of feels like placed onto the paper. Here we're actually painting into that atmosphere, and the atmosphere surrounds our figures and gives us that soft quality that we see in the rain. So we're going to take some advantage, use this to some advantage today. Also, one point I want to make as we finish this part of the exercise is notice how the color is separating, mixing them sort of strongly. I'm mixing them pretty well on the palette, but I would say actually I'm mixing them loosely so that when I put it into a wet area, that brown and blue separate, giving me a nuance that I like. So someplace we see a little blue edge or darker blue, then it is followed by a brown and back and forth. And so it has, even with two colors, you can create sort of a colorful feel. Same happens up above, but this is more dramatic because we're painting into the wet area. So we've practiced now the wet onto dry technique and wet into wet and dry into wet. So these are two distinct edges. Let's practice some rough edges. I'm going to tape down another piece of paper. In the same manner. You can see when I take the paper off, there is a light gray there. And if you, once this dries, you're going to see it's a little bluer above, a little warmer blue. Also a nice nuance with the wet on wet technique. Tape down a second piece of paper. And we'll divide that in half as well. Okay, and the same image, really, you know, this is helpful for getting us ready to do our painting. A couple figures in the back. You know, put one more over here. No, we don't really want anything complicated for our practice, just simplicity. And we're getting really good at creating this little dog. So I have a feeling he's going to be in our painting. Okay, this technique I want to show you is dry brush, and we've practiced that together to some extent in our previous paintings, exercises. We've used it primarily in working into elements we've already created, the sides of buildings or the street or whatever. So to do that, look at the difference in these two brushes. This one has a nice fine tip. This one is pretty beat up. And I have a little marking here that reminds me. The reason I use this brush is because this technique, we're kind of building up the image using dry paper and a pretty dry brush. And so you'll hear my brush making sort of a scratching sound. I'm also using rough paper, which has a tooth to it. I like this. You can use cold press. This technique does not work so well with hot press paper because we're taking advantage of the texture of the paper. Let's see what I mean here. So I pick up some paint. You can pick up a lot or a little, but I do take a little bit off of my brush and I start to build it up in a dry fashion. I'm going to actually use stronger paint, I think. So pretty thick paint, very little water. And you get dry marks. It's right here. This is the quality of the mark that I want. There is a lot of control in this technique. You can hear that sound now. Take paint, take a little out. I'm going to go ahead and add his reflection. So we're constantly kind of trying to get the right amount of paint in the brush to get these broken edges. These broken edges are possible because we don't have much liquid in the brush and we're working on rough paper. It is hard on the brush, so that's why I reserve, you know, a well-used brush for this technique. And I'm going to put an umbrella. It's a very kind of loose technique. We're trying to evoke broken edges or rough edges, which may also create a feeling of atmosphere. Here it feels like the white of the paper is actually moving in and out of our subject. Since it's a dry technique, the paper dries very quickly, and we can go back in and add little things. If I darken his head, for example, well, it's going to feel like he's walking away, which I really don't want, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put a little darker passage along the front. And we do the same with the reflections. Let's, continue this technique. Most of our paintings, we're using multiple techniques. We're not just using one. I've isolated them here so that you get an idea, a very consistent idea of how the paint is going to work, so you're not surprised. There's a nice mark, see, where it's just a little broken. And here too, the paint separates a little bit if you mix it loosely on the paper. So this is great for control. We do have a lot of control. We can easily, if we should want to, just take a wet brush, for example, and return to this and evoke a very hard edge like we did in the first panel. We can blend that, lose all the rough edges, and suddenly we have a hard edge. So it's very easy to manipulate that if we want. But I want you to appreciate how we create a readable form or readable shape that has broken edges, and it kind of dissolves into the white of the paper so that this white starts to feel like an atmosphere. This is dry brush. And I like to use that a lot in paintings to evoke different things, foliage, texture on buildings. One thing that I use it a lot for, that we'll use it for in this painting, is the pavers. There's another smaller brush I have that is pretty well worn. So in our painting, for example, we're going to have some broken strokes that suggest pavement, or that suggest like stones that are laying next to each other. And so a dry brush is good for this because it leaves a little bit of a sparkle on the surface. Dry brush. I try to put a little accent of color with dry brush. So you just take a little red, place it into there. So it becomes a subtle expression as well. The last one. The last one is, I guess the best way to describe it is lost and found edges, where these, to some extent, the wet on wet and dry brush even more so, the edge disappears and reappears. The edge disappears and reappears. The edge disappears and reappears. Lost and found. But this is utilizing more of a wet technique. So what we do is we spot wet the paper, and I'll show you what that means, but we place a little bit of liquid on the paper and we paint into it while it's still wet, and we get a combination of hard and soft edges. So let's try that. I'm going to use this big brush again. And here I want to leave some white of the paper. So I'm going to use a medium strength wash so that we can see what's happening. I want to get plenty of liquid into this brush. I don't want to have to make too many marks. And let's just start up here. Kind of random, actually very random. And I'm going to put just a little more paint into that. In this particular style too, the timing becomes a factor. Yeah, just be random. Just be random. That's fine. Now I want to use, let's keep this wet by just putting a little moisture under there. It's not going to upset what's here too much, and it'll keep it wet enough that we can mix up a little thicker paint here. I'm going to use my medium-sized brush, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, same two colors, that's all we're using. I didn't draw this time, so I'll just kind of emulate. Yeah, let's put it here, my figure. Starting the same way with the torso. And let's put an umbrella. This is pretty wet here. It's gonna flow quite a bit. Let's do the same with the distant figures. Ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. Kind of the same positions. I'm not gonna really manipulate my image based on the first layer, although I suppose you could. And here we go, right here, leg, another leg. Reflections. Let's put the umbrella first. I'm going to put a round umbrella this time. Like they're carrying it on their shoulder. And dog. Here. Well, maybe put one ear in that dry area. The rest is going to be sort of dissolving. So we're using, yes, wet into wet technique or dry into wet technique. But we're taking advantage of some dry areas to give us sort of a lost and found edge. What I feel this is good for is like if you want to indicate some movement of the atmosphere, as though it's actually blowing snow or heavy rain. Reflections. So our figures become quite distorted. We recognize, probably because we've been painting this already, that we see some semblance of a dog or some semblance of an umbrella. So it feels much more active. The atmosphere feels much more active. This is good for background elements, for minor figures, where you just want to show a little feeling of a figure, and the reflection and the umbrella. We won't use this technique so much today, but sometimes it happens with forethought. Sometimes we plan for these sorts of edges, and sometimes they happen accidentally. As long as we know what the result might be like, I think we can be confident in just letting these marks dry, perhaps returning with a little dry technique to bring out part of this image. But notice how this color is separating. The blue separates from the brown. So we get this consistent feeling atmosphere, and our figures are really almost walking through a storm here. Where the white of the paper is, we have a sharp focus, so we pick up on the legs or the edge of an umbrella, the thigh, the ear, or the tail. Okay, 4 different types of edges that most of our watercolors are built on using these 4 types of edges, and they impart different qualities. I think different qualities specifically in the sort of atmosphere or light that we're trying to present. The dry technique is easier for us. The wet technique is a little more difficult, but we can use both to effect in the same painting to create wonderful atmospheres. All right, I think we're warmed up. Let's move on to to drawing our scene for today, which is rain falling in Paris. And the specific location is near the Place du Vosges, which is a wonderful park area. We're looking down a side street, seeing cars and everything that you see in Paris. But we'll be using these figures, or figures like these, to portray our scene.